On Tuesday, the UAE suddenly announced that they would be leaving the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, an international cartel of oil exporting countries. The UAE are not the first country to leave the cartel. Qatar withdrew in 2019, Ecuador in 2020, and Angola in 2024. But they're probably the most significant departure in recent history, given that the UAE was one of OPEC's biggest producers and had been a member for over 50 years. So in this video, we're going to explain why the UAE left and whether this could spell the beginning of the end for OPEC. Epstein was ranked 13th in our list of the world's most influential people. So, in the latest issue of our magazine, Too Long, we explain how Epstein remains so influential more than 6 years after his death, and the seemingly endless revelations that continue to raise issues for the powerful people who were once in his orbit. That's just one of 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So for those of you who don't know, OPEC was formed in 1960 by Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait and Venezuela, but it only really became globally relevant in the 1970s, thanks to both a decline in American oil production and a dramatic expansion in OPEC membership, which meant that by 1970, the cartel accounted for half of global oil production. OPEC's power really became apparent in 1973, when most of OPEC, plus Egypt and Syria, declared they would be cutting oil production and imposing an oil embargo against Western countries supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. In just a couple of weeks, oil prices quadrupled from about $3 per barrel to $12, triggering inflation and political turmoil across the West. OPEC's power waned in the 80s and 90s as a rise in non-OPEC production from places like Alaska, the North Sea and the Gulf of Mexico pushed OPEC's share of total production down from about 50% to more like 35%. There was then a second golden era in the 2000s, when surging demand from China, and again an expanded membership, meant that, via a series of production cuts, OPEC were able to push up prices from their post-2008 low of $35 a barrel to more like $100 a barrel in 2011, where they hovered until late 2014. However, persistently high prices encouraged the development of the shale sector in the US, triggering a surge in American production throughout the 2010s, which undercut OPEC and ultimately brought down global prices. In an attempt to regain control, in 2016, OPEC was massively expanded to add 11 more countries, including most notably Russia, which is, along with Saudi Arabia and the US, one of the big three oil producers in the world. This new mega-alliance was known as OPEC Plus and accounted for about half of global oil production. Some OPEC Plus members, and especially the Saudis, who are sort of the de facto leaders, were optimistic that this expanded cartel would once again be able to set prices. So, beginning around 2022, OPEC Plus started consistently cutting production, with the Saudis saying they wanted to get prices up to $100 a barrel. But prices rarely went above $80, in large part because less OPEC production encouraged more production in non-OPEC countries, like the US, Canada, Brazil, Guyana and Argentina. This reflects a structural problem for OPEC. Every time they try to exploit their cartel position and cut production, the subsequent rise in prices encourages more exploration and development in non-OPEC producers, which usually creates more non-OPEC supply, which means global prices stabilize and OPEC ultimately ends up with less control over the market, as happened with the shale boom. This is why these production cuts have provoked some irritation amongst other OPEC members, who see the Saudis as overbearing and think the cuts are ineffective or self-defeating. This is especially true for the UAE, who've always grated against what they see as Saudi dominance, and who happen to have a lot of spare capacity. This, by the way, is why the UAE are also so important to OPEC. Even though they're technically only the fourth largest producer, only they and the Saudis are able to quickly and dramatically increase or decrease output. And, well, this is probably the fundamental reason that the UAE have decided to quit. They want to pump more oil themselves. However, this doesn't explain the timing. After all, the UAE have been complaining about this for the best part of 3 years now, and the war in Iran means that, for the first time in years, the UAE can't actually export more oil. So, why are they leaving OPEC now? Well, we see at least 3 reasons: Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the US. Let's start with the Saudis. For context, UAE-Saudi relations have been going downhill for years now, driven largely by disagreements over foreign policy. The UAE have generally been more pro-Israel than the Saudis, and have supported separatist groups, whom the Saudis consider destabilizing, in Sudan, Somalia, and perhaps most notably, Yemen, where tensions erupted into the open earlier this year after the Saudis intervened aggressively against the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council. There was some hope that the war in Iran and the prospect of a common enemy might encourage a rapprochement, but this hasn't happened, and the UAE have instead been infuriated by the Saudis' conspicuously muted reaction to the war. This leads us on to the second reason, Russia. The UAE are clearly also irritated by Moscow's support for Iran, and ditching OPEC Plus is a good way of making both their frustration felt and reducing Russia's influence over global oil markets. Third and finally is the US. More so than the rest of the Gulf, the UAE has clearly cast its lot with America and Israel, who will both welcome its decision to ditch OPEC, given both the US and Israel generally want lower prices. It's also worth noting that, only a few days ago, the UAE asked the US for financial support to help it deal with the fallout from the Iran war. In response, the US Treasury announced it would be providing the UAE with what's known as a swap line, which essentially means the UAE can exchange its currency for dollars at a set exchange rate, providing it with a reliable supply of greenbacks. Given the timing and the fact the Trump administration is clearly desperate to see oil prices fall, it's at least possible that this support was conditional on the UAE leaving OPEC. So those are the reasons why the UAE left OPEC, but what does this mean now for the cartel? Well, it probably won't make much difference in the immediate term, because, as we mentioned a second ago, the UAE can't actually export much more oil while the Strait of Hormuz is closed. In the medium term, however, it will mean OPEC having less sway over global markets, because they now control a small share of global production. And in the longer term, it could genuinely spell the end of the cartel. Cheating was already rife, and will only get worse as Gulf and Arab countries desperately try to recoup the losses incurred by the war in Iran. The other big non-Arab producers, like Russia and Venezuela, are also unlikely to abide by their quotas. Russia needs every dollar to fund the war in Ukraine, and Venezuela is currently doing whatever the US tells it to. Finally, many smaller cartel members will presumably start to question whether being bossed around by the Saudis is worth it, especially if OPEC can't really control global oil prices anyway. So you're probably wondering what's next for this story and how it's going to develop over the coming days and weeks, but it might be overwhelming to try and sift through thousands of news articles trying to find the one that you can trust not to feed you a false narrative. Luckily, we have a simple solution for you, and that solution is Ground News. You've probably heard us talk about Ground News before, the app and website that shows how the same story is covered across the political spectrum. But now, more than ever, we need Ground News to truly understand what's really going on in the world around us. It's difficult finding trustworthy news sources, so Ground News will do the hard work for you, compiling thousands of articles and putting them in one easy-to-access place. Each article even comes with a breakdown into bias distribution, factuality, and ownership of each individual source. For instance, if we take this story on the UAE leaving OPEC, we can easily see that 18 sources are currently reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the right. Looking at the headlines, we can dive deeper to understand the differences in reporting on each side, with the left focusing much more on energy prices and the right shifting the emphasis to the impact on the cartel. Our absolute favourite feature, though, is their blind spot feed. Here you can see all the stories you might not have seen on your usual feed, so even if you don't agree with the reporting, it's good to step out of your bubble. And it's not just us that feel this way. The Nobel Peace Centre also proudly endorses Ground News, calling it an excellent way to stay informed, avoid echo chambers, and expand your worldview. So if you want to start questioning the narrative, you can join Ground News today, and using our link will get you 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description. Go to ground.news/TLDR or scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.